Welcome everyone to the Democrats Are Out and Proud Trans Day of Visibility Town Hall. My name is Earl Folks and I'm the DNC's LGBTQ Caucus Chair. I am so proud to be a Democrat and I'm proud to be a member of a national political party who is willing to stand with the transgender community every day, as well as a special Transgender Day of Visibility. Transgender Day of Visibility is an annual event occurring on March 31st, dedicated to celebrating the lives of transgender people worldwide and acknowledging their contributions, courage, and resiliency to society. In addition, Transgender Day of Visibility gives us all the opportunity to raise awareness to the discrimination and physical danger that many in the transgender community face every day. The first Transgender Day of Visibility was held on March 31st, 2009. The DNC and the LGBT Caucus are committed to ensuring that the transgender community is represented in all the work we do in the DNC. 30 members of the transgender community were delegates at the 2020 National Convention, which was the most ever. But we know that this is not enough. And I'm pleased to announce that the DNC and LGBT Caucus will be organizing a transgender ad hoc committee, which will be focusing on expanding transgender participation in the Democratic Party. Now it's my pleasure to introduce to you Jaime Harrison, the DNC chairman, who is a friend and ally to the LGBT community. Chairman Harrison and his staff has been working very hard to make certain that everyone is included under the Democratic tent, including members of the transgender community. Chairman Harrison.
Thank you so much, Earl, for that introduction. Thank you for your leadership and your friendship of our LGBTQ caucus. I also want to thank all of our special guests who've joined us today. I'm looking forward to hearing from all of you. My friends, happy Trans Day of Visibility. I firmly believe that our country is at its best when we serve all of our citizens and when our government reflects the diversity of our nation. That's why the Biden-Harris administration has an historic number of LGBTQ appointees. But representation is only a first step, my friends. We need to build on the landmark Supreme Court victory that enshrines civil rights protections for queer and trans folks. This administration has already taken decisive action to protect the civil rights of queer and trans people. On day one in office, President Biden signed one of the most comprehensive executive orders in history on LGBTQ rights. It ensures that across the board, from healthcare to fair housing to civil rights enforcement, protecting folks from discrimination on the basis of gender identity and sexual orientation is a top priority for this administration and for the Democratic Party. The Biden-Harris administration has increased funding for research and expanded access for gender-affirming healthcare. This administration has prioritized the needs of trans and queer kids in foster care and will continue fighting for safety and justice for missing and murdered trans Indigenous people. We need more justice, and we need more justice right now. More inclusion, not less. And that's why what we're seeing from these Republican state lawmakers and the Republican Party in general is so alarming. They're attacking trans kids. They're trying to limit classroom discussions. These policies can have lasting impact on the safety and confidence of young queer and trans people. And it's important that we continue to push back. Folks, it makes me think of the words of Dr. King in his letter from a Birmingham jail. He said in that letter, we will repent in this generation, not merely for the hateful words and actions of the bad people, but for the appalling silence of the good people. It's time for the good people across this country, in this party, to stand up and not to be silent. It's just as important that we continue to show trans people and the parents of trans children that the Democratic Party has their back and that the Democratic Party will not be silent in the face of this bigotry. That we're going to fight for their civil rights and address their everyday needs. That trans rights, that the right to be who you are, isn't up for negotiation. LGBTQ voters represent a large, reliable voting bloc for the Democratic Party. Whether you are a member of the community or an ally, thank you for your continued support. The DNC takes its responsibility to the trans community extremely seriously, which is why we're going to do everything that we can to elect Democrats up and down the ticket. You know, I'm wearing this shirt today. It's a DNC shirt that says, "We matter, we count, we will be heard." In the trans community, you matter, you count, and yes, you will be heard. And we will stand shoulder to shoulder to make sure that happens. But again, we need your help. We need you to get involved with the DNC signature program, Democrats Are Out and Proud, by pledging to host an Out and Proud party during this year's Pride Month. At these parties, you can explain to your networks why it's critical that the LGBTQ community turns out for Democrats so that we can do everything that we can to protect LGBTQ and trans communities on a national level, but also within our states. You can use the link in the chat box below to take the pledge, and a member of our staff will reach out with more details. So thank you all again for everything that you do for the Democratic Party. Thank you for standing up for the trans community and the LGBTQ community as a whole. It's an honor to be in this fight with each and every one of you. With that, I turn things over to our amazing director of the LGBTQ plus coalitions group, Sam Alvin. Sam, over to you. Thank you, my friend.
Thank you, Chair Harrison, and hello, Democrats. Happy Trans Day of Visibility. It's an absolute honor to be celebrating here with all of you today. As the chair noted, this is the first event in our LGBTQ signature programming here at the DNC. Democrats Are Out and Proud. And more importantly, it is the first time the DNC has celebrated the Trans Day of Visibility with a town hall and engagement for the community. I'm so glad to be able to celebrate this day in such style with an amazing roundtable that we have for you. I'm going to get right to it and start introducing our guests. First, Senator Sarah McBride represents Delaware's 1st State Senate District. She's been involved in community advocacy for most of her life, including working for former Governor Jack Markle, the late Attorney General Bill Biden, and as the National Press Secretary of the Human Rights Campaign most recently. She is the first openly transgender state senator in the country, which makes her as well the highest ranking transgender or openly transgender elected official in United States history. Our next guest, Honey Mahogany, is a performer, MC, social worker, and activist who currently serves as chair of the San Francisco Democratic Party, and as you can see, has a very impressive library behind her. She is a legislative aide at the San Francisco District 6 Supervisor Matt Haney. Honey is also the co-founder of the Transgender Cultural District, has been featured across queer media and programming on ABC, HBO, and perhaps most famously on RuPaul's Drag Race. And finally, last but not least, Rodrigo Heng-Lehtinen is the executive director of the National Center for Trans Equality Action Fund. He is a transgender policy, advocacy, and messaging expert. As a Cuban American and openly transgender man, he has a wide-ranging experience in the LGBTQ movement, has covered many areas such as field organizing, leadership development, fundraising, and media advocacy. Hello, panelists. How are you doing on this Trans Day of Visibility?
Doing great.
Hey, thank you so much.
Fantastic. Happy to be here.
Excellent, excellent. We're so happy to have you here with us today. Today is most definitely a celebration of all that y'all have brought and your community brings to the Democratic Party. But I do feel like we would be remiss to call it a day about visibility without talking about the full ranges of issues facing the trans community, most notably the widespread legislative attacks that we're seeing in state legislatures across the country. We have seen over 300 anti-LGBTQ bills proposed in this last state leg session alone, from a range of issues limiting and attacking and targeting the community, but specifically against trans kids and youth, limiting their healthcare access, trying to turn safe schools into hostile environments for them, and all around trying to make them feel as though they don't belong. So I think we should start by talking about the issues that face this community today. And I'm going to start with you, State Senator McBride. Tell us, as a sitting state senator, what are we seeing? What are the trends? Can you sort of walk us through what it's like being in the state Senate as all of these attacks are happening, at least in Delaware, and sort of what we're seeing nationally in terms of trends?
Sure. Well, first off, Sam, it's great to join you and just two incredible trans leaders, Rodrigo and Honey, who I so admire and so appreciate both of them for all of their work. And I just got to say, honey, that color coordination on your bookshelf is super impressive. It's also great to not only be on with you, Sam, but also my friend Earl Folks, and of course, our fearless chairman, Jaime Harrison. I'm really proud to be here as both a proud Democrat and a proud trans person. But as you alluded to, as we've talked about already, as we've heard already, this is a really difficult year and time for many in the trans community. And I think right now the landscape facing trans people, particularly at the state legislative level, is the dual story of progress and pain, which is so often the story that our community faces, that our country faces. Of course, the elephant in the room, no pun intended, are the relentless and cruel attacks by the Republican Party in state legislatures across the country. And you touched on the scope of these attacks, whether we're talking about legislation trying to ban trans students from educational programs, including athletics consistent with their gender identity, whether we're talking about legislation that's seeking to ban discussion or ban books, whether we're talking about efforts to rip trans kids away from their parents and forbid them from being able to access medically necessary transition-related care. All of these attacks are part of a national strategy put forward by the same people who resisted marriage equality, who pushed North Carolina's anti-trans bathroom bill. And what they're trying to do is they're honing in and targeting some of the most vulnerable people within our community, young people. And they're doing it because they understand that the clock is ticking on their capacity to license and legislate discrimination. And this national strategy is seeking to rip trans kids away from all of the different layers of support that they may have, from their parents, from providers, from teachers, from classmates and coaches and teammates, in order to make them feel so alone, in order to make life so difficult for these kids that, and let's be clear, some never grow up to be adults. And so we have to be crystal clear about the stakes and the consequences of these incredibly hateful attacks. And these hateful attacks are coming, one, because they realize that the clock is ticking, but also because the Republican Party has no real ideas to actually uplift and empower people, to meet the challenges that we face as a country, to get us through the end of this pandemic, to help rebuild our economy, to build our country back better. They don't have plans to expand access to paid family and medical leave or lower the cost of prescription drugs or make childcare more affordable. They don't have plans to actually improve our public schools. And so they're trying to distract and divide us. And that's what these attacks, coupled with the other attacks we're seeing against marginalized people in this country, that's what they are seeking to do. But I also want to be clear, and I don't want to take too much time on this answer, that despite these attacks, one of the things we have seen is that every single time these anti-trans right-wing extremists come for our community, we end up organizing in new ways, we end up mobilizing, we end up having conversations with our community and our country that serve to open hearts and change minds, and in the end, sow the seeds of the destruction of the politics of hate that they seek to implement. And not only that, but in blue states across the country, we continue to move equality forward. We continue to pass legislation that here in Delaware, we're working to remove barriers to updating folks' names so that trans people can have access to identity documents and accurate documents that reflect who they are. We're working to amend our Constitution to provide clear and explicit protections for the LGBTQ community, not just in statute, but in our state constitution. We'd be the first state to do that. And increasingly across the country, in red states and blue states, we see trans people who are not only coming to those state capitals as advocates and as members of the public, but as members of those legislatures, and who are standing in the way of these attacks and who are leading the charge to move equality forward. Just last week, I presided over the Health Committee, which I chair in the Delaware State Senate, and we heard one of those anti-LGBTQ, anti-trans laws. And for decades, trans people have had to come before anti-trans lawmakers in the big chair. But now anti-trans forces have to come before trans people in the big chair. And while that isn't everything, it does make a difference. It changes the conversation. And hopefully for those trans people who have to see these attacks, and increasingly the trans people who don't just see the attacks, but are experiencing these attacks, hopefully that representation, those out trans Democratic legislators, are providing a little bit of comfort and a little bit of hope.
Absolutely. Thank you, Senator McBride, for that. I think you've just touched and articulated on so many excellent points, particularly it's an intentional national strategy, right? And in so much of that, we also do lose sight that all politics is local, which is why I'm so excited to have Chair Mahogany on. I'd love to kick this question over to you. You're the chair of a local Democratic Party in San Francisco. You work for a supervisor. How are these attacks translating there at the local level?
That's a really good question. I mean, I think in San Francisco in particular, it's really hard to come out with anti-trans or anti-LGBT legislation. Even in the state of California, it's not going to be successful. That being said, we are still experiencing, homophobia and transphobia on an everyday basis. We still are seeing, trans people murdered. Just a few weeks ago, there was a Black trans woman who was kidnapped for several days here in the San Francisco Bay Area. So, we are still experiencing trauma and hurt. And some of that may be also as a result of this sort of national conversation and this national scapegoating of the trans community as this boogeyman that the Republican Party, as Sarah so beautifully put, is using as sort of a last resort, right? Because they have nothing going for them, and so they need to scare their last remaining followers into action and into sort of maintaining what power they have left. So hopefully we are going to see that shift. I will say that in California we're actually making some pretty cool gains. I mean, we just had the appointment of Judge Andy Mudrick to serve on the Sacramento County's Superior Court, and she will be the second transgender person to serve as a trial court judge in California. So that is historic, and she's actually the first one to be appointed by a governor in the state of California. Also, I think that what we are seeing locally throughout our state is that, as again, Sarah had said, we are really getting motivated to put our own boots into action, because we know that here in California, we are the nation's most populous state, and we definitely feel a certain obligation to make sure that we are pushing for more Democratic representation within the state, but also, of course, in the House. So, I think we believe really strongly that the road to maintaining and hopefully, improving upon the House majority really does run through California. And so, the San Francisco Democratic Party has joined a coalition of San Francisco or Bay Area County Central Committees, as well as organizations like Swing Left and other local Democratic clubs, to really put our energy into registering voters across the state, specifically in the Central Valley and in places like Orange County that are becoming more blue. And we're also, working to get Democrats elected down ballot in other states as well, including in Nevada and Arizona. So we are definitely doing a lot of the legwork here to make sure that, that these attacks will soon be hopefully a thing of the past. And, really, maybe we can actually do some things on the federal level that will help make sure that these types of attacks aren't able to happen.
Yeah, absolutely. And we will definitely dive into all the Biden-Harris administration is doing and has done for the trans and LGBTQ community. But you just touched on a plethora of things that people are doing to push back. But Rodrigo, we would be remiss if we didn't ask your perspective here as the executive director of NCTE Actions Fund. How are people pushing back against these legislative attacks, and how can people on the line now get involved to support that work?
Well, people are pushing back in every way you can think of. It used to be that decades ago, people think that now, there's all of these state bills against transgender people and that this is unprecedented. And it's true. But if you take the really long view, it's unprecedented because 10, 20, 30 years ago, our issues weren't even considered controversial. We were just universally ridiculed. The fact that it's really because we as trans people and allies have been organizing and have been mobilizing, and we have been fighting back. That's why we've grown as much public support as we have. And that's why now it's a controversy. And the Republican Party is trying to take advantage of this last window where most Americans still don't fully understand maybe what it is to be trans. More and more of us are coming out every day. and we're coming out at younger ages. So I'm confident that it is just a matter of time until everyone in the United States realizes that they really do know somebody who's trans, and that we're maybe not that interesting and not worth legislating around. But in the meantime, we are still fighting these bad bills in roughly half the country. And I draw a lot of encouragement from the fact that trans people are fighting in every way, from testifying at the state legislatures to calling their state representatives, showing up at school board meetings, registering their friends to vote. People are really getting out there and using all of the tactics available, educating our neighbors and our peers that being trans is nothing to be scared of. In terms of how to get involved, I would say it's two things. One is look up your state and see if there's a bad bill, an anti-trans bill, and then call your state rep if there is, call your state senator. Don't assume that just because you live in a blue state, that means there's not an anti-trans bill. The best, even in a state where that is majority Democrat legislature, which is not going to let a thing like this pass, the best thing we can do is to still make anti-trans bills politically toxic. We can come out in such full force against them that the opposition doesn't even bother to try next time. So again, whether you live in a blue state or a red state or a swing state, pick up the phone, call your state rep or your state senator, and tell them to be on the right side of history. The second thing you can do is help the trans people in your life vote and get people to vote. That might sound like a funny thing to say, why single out trans people about voting? Well, the thing is, a lot of us don't have IDs that accurately reflect who we are. Senator McBride alluded to this earlier, that it is hard to sometimes get the right ID that shows your authentic gender. And that can trip you up when you go to the polls. So we have resources for this at the NCTE Action Fund. Check out transformthevote.org. Again, that's transformthevote.org. We can answer your questions about voter ID laws. We can get you resources. And if you ever have any trouble at the polls, we can get you help. But make sure to share those resources far and wide. They make it easier for people to vote. And the more of us turn out to vote, the more power we have.
Absolutely. Vote, vote, vote. I will never be mad with people saying that at a DNC event. We touched a lot on these attacks, and I think each of you have spoken a little bit about this, but just to be explicit, today is a celebration. And I have found the defiance and resilience both within the trans community as they've pushed back against these attacks to be extraordinarily inspiring to me in my own work. And I'm just curious if each of you would like to share anything that you've seen in the response and the outpouring of support that we have seen that has just sort of inspired and fueled you as we've moved through this last legislative session. Hani, should I kick it off to you to start?
Yeah, I mean, I think one thing that comes to mind for me is I think that there is tremendous resilience, and we do have places like California where, there are a lot of services that serve the trans community. And I know one thing that I'm really excited about that California is doing, and San Francisco specifically, is really looking at how we can increase our capacity to offer services to people who may be, fleeing other states because of anti-trans laws, or who no longer feel comfortable in their home states because of those laws. And, this doesn't just apply to the trans community. This also applies to cisgender women and all birthing people. We know that those rights are very much under attack. And so the state and the city of San Francisco is really looking at how do we provide support for people who may be wanting to move to a place where they feel safe and feel like they can access care, or even for people who may need to come to California in order to get the care that they need. So those are some things that I think that are incredibly positive that are coming out of this that is happening here.
Thank you. Rodrigo, anything you'd like to share?
Well, I draw so much inspiration from everything the Biden-Harris administration is doing. And I know that sounds cheesy, but this is the first time that we've had a presidential administration that acknowledges that Trans Day of Visibility even exists. I mean, it's pretty spectacular. Just today, I got to join other transgender advocates and trans young people and their supportive parents at the White House, where Vice President Harris even swung by, and second gentleman, I love being able to say that, the second gentleman came by, and Admiral Levine, to offer these words of encouragement and even kind of brainstorm and strategize with the trans community. That's never happened before. It is just really inspiring to see how far we've come. And it's inspiring to think about what else we can do if we keep up this momentum. So I draw a lot of inspiration from seeing that as much as we may be fighting these battles in the States, the White House still has our back, and we just got to make sure to keep it that way.
Yeah, absolutely. I was about to say, don't go through your whole Biden-Harris shtick just yet, because we'll be moving on to that in just a moment. Sarah, is there anything you'd like to offer up as well?
Yeah, I'll just say two quick things. The first, when I loved what Rodrigo had to say about how, these bills are popping up by Republican legislators in red states or blue states. And even if you're in a blue state where you know that a bill won't pass, it is still so important to speak up and to make it clear that the public is in opposition to these cruel attacks. When we had the hearing just last week on the anti-trans bill, during public comment, 8 out of every 10 speakers was there in opposition to the legislation and in solidarity with trans people. And I remember when I used to go as an advocate to the legislative hall in Dover, Delaware, to advocate for LGBTQ equality legislation, we were always outnumbered by the opponents. And to have this hearing where we had trans people speaking out, yes, but we also had so many allies, both neighbors, but also allies who represented our state's healthcare institutions, allies that represented the State Education Association, allies that represented domestic violence prevention organizations and gender equity groups there to speak in support of trans people. That would have been impossible just 10 years ago when I was testifying as an advocate for the first time, to have that level of support for trans people. And I think the second thing I'll say is that, Rodrigo also touched on this, that a lot of these attacks are a byproduct of the progress that we've made. And the fact that we are talking about trans young people, that kind of conversation would have been incomprehensible just 10 or 15 years ago. The fact that these trans young people exist today in the numbers that they exist is a reflection of our progress. I think so many of us who grew up just in the 90s, I grew up, I was born in 1990. I still hopefully am considered young. I didn't know any trans people who were out and young. And now the number of trans young people who are out and proud in their communities is such, to me, an inspiring reflection of how far we've come.
Totally. And speaking of the progress that we've made, we really have seen for the first time in our history what it really means to have a whole of government response stand up for the LGBTQ community, which including the response that we've seen in support of the trans community and trans youth. So I'm going to pivot now to the Biden-Harris administration, which has been very clear and decisive that the Democratic Party will fight and stand with our trans community, will fight and stand with our trans youth, and will do everything that they can within their power to push back against these attacks. And from each of your perspectives here today, I would love for you just to discuss some of the accomplishments that you have seen that have been significant to you, or what it might mean to have a White House that supports our community in place. And Rodrigo, I think I'll kick it over to you. You were just at the White House, as you mentioned, for the same celebration. So exciting.
Yeah, very exciting. And one big marquee win from the Biden-Harris administration for trans people that I would highlight is being able to finally get passports that accurately reflect our gender, including an X gender marker for people who are non-binary. Now, I know when I say passports, it can sound like, what are you, traveling on some European vacation or something? But that's not what it's about at all for trans people. In many states, it is still quite difficult to update your driver's license or your state ID to show the name you actually go by or your authentic gender. It can cost thousands of dollars. It may require specific medical procedures that aren't actually even right for you there are all sorts of reasons why you might not be able to update your driver's license or your state ID if you're trans. So if you're in one of those states, you need your passport to have accurate ID. The passport isn't just about traveling, it's about having an actual government ID that shows your true name and your true gender so that you have a valid ID to show when you're applying for a new apartment or signing a lease or applying for jobs or anything like that. So passports are critical. And thanks to the Biden-Harris administration, now you don't need all of these hoops to jump through about surgery or anything like that to update the M or F box, male or female box on your passport. And even more so, you just starting in 2 weeks, you'll be able to get the X gender marker, which, as I mentioned, is if you are non-binary or otherwise just don't even want to share your gender, you could check that X box to have kind of an alternative option. And we've never seen that before out of the federal government. But thanks to this administration, now transgender people, we can have an ID that accurately shows who we are. No matter what state we live in, no matter where we are, we can get a government ID that's accurate. So that is a very exciting one to me.
Yeah, absolutely. Sarah, I'm curious if there's anything that stands out to you.
Well, I think one, the scale of advancements during the Biden-Harris administration, literally from day one, right? The president rescinding one of the most notorious anti-trans Trump administration actions when he rescinded the trans troop ban, the executive order requiring this whole of government approach to evaluate how government policy can better support trans people, the Department of Justice and the Department of Education and the Department of Health and Social Services weighing in and standing with trans young people in court cases challenging these anti-trans laws. The list goes on. My mom actually called me and asked me, can you read me this press release that the White House just put out with the new announcements today? I said, I honestly don't have time to read you this entire thing because it is so extensive. But I just want to say, I think that reflects something unique about this president, which is that he, more than any president we've ever had, truly sees and understands our community. Delaware is a really small state, so we all know one another. And I've had the privilege of knowing the president pretty much my whole life. And I worked for his son, Beau, who was a fierce champion of trans rights during his time as Attorney General. And as folks know, unfortunately, we lost Beau to cancer several years ago. And I think in many ways, the president feels this issue deep in his bones. One, because he knows trans people personally. And I have seen the tears in his eyes when he talks about the epidemic of violence against trans women of color. I've heard the passion in his voice when he talks about the need to pass the Equality Act. I've been the beneficiary of his big heart and his neighborly love when I came out. And so he's passionate from a personal perspective about this issue. But I also think in many ways, people always ask, why is he so passionate about it beyond that? And part of it is he feels like he is carrying Beau Biden's legacy on, because Beau Biden spent his time as AG championing trans rights. And I think in many ways, the president feels closer to Beau when he's fighting for trans people. And that is, I think, a beautiful testament to Beau's legacy. And I think it is a profound reflection of this president's deep personal commitment to our community and our cause.
Yeah, thank you so much, Sarah. And last but never least, Honey, is there anything you'd like to offer about the significance here? Go ahead.
Oh yeah, I mean, I affirming that passports are definitely a big deal. I know that there were several states that were, offering affirming gender markers, but it really makes a huge difference to be able to, have a passport that matches and, just makes things so much easier for trans people. I do want to, also note that, I'm not super surprised that President Biden has been so progressive. I'm actually, we have to remember that he also pushed Obama, right, when it came to coming out in support of gay marriage. President Biden has always or has been for a long time, very supportive of the LGBT community, even at times when it was controversial or maybe people felt like he shouldn't be. So I'm deeply appreciative of his support so far. And it is definitely a breath of fresh air with the Biden-Harris administration coming on the heels of the Trump administration, where we did see so many of our fundamental rights just constantly under attack, even in the way in which our protections, that are part of the Affordable Care Act were undermined, right? And having the Biden administration reaffirm that no, LGBTQ people are protected under the Affordable Care Act and should have access to healthcare and cannot be discriminated based on their gender identity or sexual orientation. That's huge and has definitely made me personally feel much more safe, and I'm sure trans people across the country feel much more safe and cared for. Some things that I'd really like to see happen on the federal level that I think we're still waiting for are again broader protections for trans people, so that we can't I don't think we can leave it up to states to to continue to do some of the things that they are doing. Obviously some of this will lie with the Supreme Court, but along those lines, maybe it's time that we get a Supreme Court nominee or even an LGBT person on the Supreme Court. And additionally, some more low-hanging fruit, and this isn't specifically trans, though it certainly affects trans people, would also be to remove the restrictions on, the guidelines for MSMs and gay men for donating blood. There are so many countries across the world who have removed all of those restrictions. We have the technology and testing that can guarantee that all blood is safe. So I just think it's time that we, finally remove those restrictions.
Yeah, and all the progress that we made, just touching on that point, honey, it makes events like today here at the Democratic Party even more important for us to uplift and elevate the voices and the work of folks within our communities and within the party itself doing this work. I feel like trans activists and organizers have been fueling the Democratic Party for so long, and it is so important that we elevate their work and make sure we make space for them at our tables to celebrate them, giving people their flowers while they're here, right? And with that in mind, we've talked a lot about policy and advocacy, but today is really about so much more than that, which I'm sure all of you know. I think I'm going to combine our last two questions and really just as we with an eye to the time, how are you celebrating today? How are we taking a moment to celebrate the trans community? And how can people like me who are your cisgendered allies, show up and be more effective for you and making sure that you have that seat and that you're able to celebrate along with us? I'll start with Honey, why don't we kick it back over to you?
Sure. Thank you so much for that question. I think this is a great one because I think as electeds and community representatives and activists, many times we don't really get the chance to celebrate on days like today. A lot of us are working hard, just basically, especially if you're in a position of power or you have some sort of platform, you're working especially hard on days like today. So doing interviews and organizing events, etc. And it's hard to, I think, take the time to just sort of appreciate and feel like you are a part of it instead of putting it on or having a responsibility or a role. So I really appreciate this question. I will also say that I definitely want to make clear that I feel like it's an honor to be in these types of positions, to serve on panels like this with other great community leaders and, be able to do all of those things. One thing that I'm really looking forward to, though, this weekend is I'm going to be part of a panel that highlights trans visibility in STEM, science, tech, engineering, and math. And that's being put on by the Transgender District. So I'm excited for that. And hopefully I'm also excited to make it out to our local TDOV celebration and awards event that's happening here in San Francisco at a place called Soma Arts, which is a really incredible venue. One thing that I think that allies can do to support the work to support trans people is really to support the work of trans-led organizations, and I think that can come in many different ways, help directly through action, show up for these organizations when they ask you to show up or offer your services, whatever they may be, or your skills. And then, of course, to donate to them, because I think one thing that people don't really take into consideration is that, there is this sort of weird thing where people are like traditional funding sources don't always give to trans-led organizations. Like there's this sort of gatekeeping and policing, like, oh, well, you know, you're trans, and especially like if you're Black and trans or Latinx and trans, there's just this like assumption that maybe you don't know what you're doing, or this, you know, this sort of people underestimating you. And so I think it's incredibly important that we change that narrative and that we actually believe that trans people know what is best for the trans community and can lead effectively, and that we invest in trans-led organizations. You know, I think it's incumbent on people in positions of power or who have exceptional skills to help really move the movement along, and also be out and loud about your allyship. So not just in these spaces, but also in your hometowns across the country with your friends. And of course, when people are making like rude remarks, like you're in a position where you are not in physical danger, you know, make sure that you're advocating for those who would be potentially in physical danger if they were in your same spot. So those are some things that I think people can do.
Yeah, absolutely. And speaking of trans-led organizations, Rodrigo, I'd love to hear from your perspective how you're celebrating today.
Yes, well, celebrating by doing events like this and trying to get the word out and make sure that everyone who cares about our issues and cares about making trans people safer is able to take action on it. In terms of what's something that cisgender, meaning non-transgender people can do, one thing is call your senator to support the Equality Act. You know, Honey mentioned we need stronger protections. A lot of people think that it is already illegal to discriminate against someone for being transgender, but that's not actually true. It's illegal in certain states, but it's still it's not illegal in roughly half of the country. The Equality Act will fix that. The Equality Act is a piece of legislation currently sitting in the Senate that would extend all of these non-discrimination protections to all 50 states and the US territories. But it's sitting in the Senate now, so we need everyone to call their senator to urge that support. If you want more information about this, you can go to passtheequalityact.org. Many different of our organizations are part of this massive coalition. Again, it's passtheequalityact.org, and we can get you that information about your senator. And if you live in a blue state, again, do not take their support for granted, because we do, yes, they're on record being in support of the bill, but they need to know that it's important. They need to know that it needs to be prioritized. And if you're in a swing state or a red state, we especially need you to call your senator. So that's one really concrete thing that our allies can do today. And then if you've already called your senator, you know, call your roommates, call your exes, call your family, get them to call their senators too, especially if they live in some of these other more conservative states.
Absolutely. Sarah, anything you're doing to celebrate today? Any ways we can show up better?
Well, certainly I'm celebrating by spending the evening with you wonderful folks, some of the most incredible LGBTQ leaders that I know of. And so that's a great way to celebrate. And then, of course, to Rodrigo's opening point about how trans people are essentially just as boring as everyone else, I'm going to celebrate by getting my favorite Thai delivery from a wonderful First District restaurant here, not too far from where I am. So I'm gonna veg out and watch the latest show that I'm binging. But you know, what I would also say is that to Honey's excellent point around supporting trans people and supporting trans-led organizations, I think on this Trans Day of Visibility and every day, our allies should be looking around in the spaces that they're in the communities that they're in. And if there isn't a trans person who's in your workplace, if there isn't an out trans person who's in government where you live, if there isn't a trans organization that has the support that it needs and that it deserves, you can help change that. You can hire trans folks, you can promote trans folks, you can empower and uplift trans folks, you can donate to trans candidates and elect trans candidates to government where you live. You can make sure that trans organizations have the support that they need to fight the fight against these cruel attacks and to move equality forward at the local, state, and federal level. But that means putting our money where our mouth is and supporting trans people in every area of life where you live, with your time, with your energy, with your voice, and yes, with your money.
That's right. Sarah, Honey, Rodrigo, Thank you so much for your time this evening. This has been a wonderful conversation. You are all truly trailblazers within the Democratic Party and the movement. It is a privilege to get to be up here with you today discussing and celebrating the Trans Day of Visibility. I so appreciate it and your time. But we have a lot of work left to do, don't we, ahead of the 2022 midterm elections? As our chairman said, we've got to leave it all out on the field. And the best thing that you can do right now is click that button down below us and agree to host an Out and Proud Pride Party in the month of June. If you are an ally, if you are a member of the community, winning in this next election is critical. We have to leave it all out on the field, and the best thing you can do right now is commit to host that party, and a member of the DNC staff will reach out to help you plan it. And it is my last distinguished honor of the evening to introduce yet another trailblazer within the trans community. She is a pediatrician and the former Secretary of Health from the great state of Pennsylvania. It is an honor to welcome, in her personal capacity, Dr. Rachel Levine.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for having me at this year's Democrats Are Out and Proud Trans Day of Visibility Town Hall. My name is Rachel Levine, and I am a proud member of the transgender community. As you all know, we are in a pivotal moment for LGBTQ rights in our fight for trans equality across the United States. We've seen landmark progress, like the victory at the Supreme Court that enshrines civil rights protections for queer and trans workers. But at the same time, we've seen cynical politicians try to villainize people based on who they are. And they're doing it because they think it'll score them political points. The reason I started working in healthcare was to help all people lead happy and healthy lives. We know that based on so many studies that people like me and other members of the LGBTQ community face significant health disparities in comparison to cisgender or straight counterparts. I've experienced many challenges in my personal career, and I have endured significant transphobia as I've overcome barriers. Yet, in spite of this, I also received so much support from my colleagues, from my family, from friends that helped to propel me to where I am today, which is what today is all about. While we shouldn't forget the work left for us to do, we must also not forget all there is to uplift us on this day of Transgender Day of Visibility. While we are here to celebrate all that the trans community has to offer, please know that the Biden-Harris administration takes the responsibility to advocate for trans people and trans youth very seriously. That is why on day one, President Biden signed one of the most comprehensive executive orders in history on transgender rights. It ensures that across the board, from healthcare to fair housing to civil rights enforcement, protecting people from discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation or gender identity is a priority for this administration. I appreciate each and every one of you for joining us today on this joyous 14th Trans Day of Visibility. Happy Trans Day of Visibility.